5 years ago, I don't think I would have bought this watch. Not because there's anything wrong with it. Actually, I think it's fantastic. But 5 years ago, I probably would have looked at this brand and compared it to Rolex, Omega, or Jaeger-LeCoultre and convinced myself that I should save my money for something better. Today, it's one of the watches that I'm most excited to wear. And that realization made me start thinking, not about this watch, but about what changed inside me as a collector. Because I don't think experienced collectors simply buy more expensive watches. I think they actually start looking for completely different things. And over the past few years, I've noticed 4 changes that seem to happen to almost every long-term watch collector. So if you've been collecting for a while, I think you'll recognize yourself somewhere in this conversation. When I first got into watches, I assumed there was a pretty obvious path. You start with something you can afford. Eventually you buy something more luxury, then even more premium, and then maybe you go on to super expensive independents, and eventually you own your Grail collection. And that's the end. But the longer I've collected, the more I've realized that that isn't really what happens. What's actually changing isn't just your collection. It's your definition of what makes a watch worth owning. And I think that happens in 4 different ways. Early on, brands are everything. They're your shortcut. You don't know enough yet to judge the finishing and the proportions and the movement and the dial work or even the wearability at times. So naturally, you trust the reputation of the brand. You watch YouTube, you read forums, you ask people on Reddit, you compare all these different rankings out there, and you learn which companies are considered prestigious watch brands. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. Brand reputation exists for a reason. But over time, something interesting starts happening. You stop asking, is this a good brand? And you start asking, is this objectively a good watch? Those 2 things are not the same question. Eventually, you notice things that would have gone completely unnoticed to you before. How a case curves around your wrist, or how a polished bevel catches the light just right, or maybe even how a dial changes depending on the angle, how a bracelet articulates, the feeling of winding a movement, the way the proportions come together, but it just becomes less important than the execution. Now, I think this next one is a little uncomfortable because most of us do it whether we admit it or not. So early in collecting, we care what other collectors think. Now, maybe not consciously, but we do. You wonder if people respect the brand, whether it's considered worth the money for you. And you wonder whether other enthusiasts approve, whether you made the right choice. There's a little desire for the validation. Now, again, that's completely normal. We're entering a hobby and we look to experienced collectors for guidance. But eventually, you become one of those experienced collectors. And something changes. You realize that you don't actually need everyone else to agree with your choices. You don't need universal approval. You don't need every watch to be so impressive. You simply need to enjoy wearing that watch. And that freedom changes everything. This one might be the biggest shift though. Early on, the question is always, what's the best watch for this amount of money? Best movement, best brand, best finishing, maybe even look at resale value, and of course, the specifications. It's all about optimization. But after enough years, the question quietly starts to change. So instead of asking, what's the best watch? You start asking, what's the best watch for me in my current situation? And those are completely different questions. Maybe you realize that you don't actually enjoy wearing larger watches. Maybe you care more about comfort than the complications of the watch. Or maybe you discover that simple 3-hand watches make you way happier than perpetual calendars. And maybe you find yourself reaching for one watch over and over while another objectively incredible watch stays in the box. Your lifestyle, your personality, and your tastes all begin to outweigh objective comparisons between watches. And I think that is where collecting starts to become way more personal. Now, this is where that watch that I talked about at the beginning comes into the conversation. When I bought this Heinrich, something surprised me. And before anybody says anything, they are not sponsoring me to make this video. This was a watch that I found and I went and researched and then I purchased with my own money. It wasn't a gift. I own this watch and I love it. It wasn't the price. It wasn't that it's from a relatively unknown German brand. It wasn't even the specifications, really. What surprised me was that I never found myself comparing it to my Jaeger-LeCoultre in a negative way, only as a contrast. And I never compared it to my Omega, and I never compared it to any other luxury watch in my collection. Instead, I found myself asking a completely different question. Will I enjoy wearing this? That's it. Do I smile when I put it on? Do I appreciate the dial, which I do? Does it make me want to look down at my wrist, which it does? And does it fit into my collection in a meaningful way? 5 years ago, I'm not sure that I would have bought this watch. Not because it wasn't good enough, but because I wasn't looking for the things that make it what it is and make it special. And that is what changed. Not the watch, but me. And that's what I think happens to a lot of long-term collectors. I don't think that collectors stop loving luxury watches. I've talked about this before. I do think that they stop needing luxury watches to justify why they love a certain watch. You know, luxury becomes one way to appreciate great watchmaking, but it's not the only way. That's a really freeing place to arrive at, because once you stop asking whether other collectors think a watch is worth owning, you can finally start asking whether it's worth owning to you. And ironically, that's usually when people build their most interesting collections yet. Not because they're chasing prestige, but because they're chasing themselves. And if I could go back and give one piece of advice to the version of myself that was just getting into this hobby, it wouldn't be, hey, go and buy a lot of different watches. It would simply be this: give yourself permission to change what you like. The watches that excite you today probably will not be the watches that define you forever, and that is okay, because becoming a better collector isn't about becoming harder to impress. It's actually about becoming more honest about what genuinely brings you joy in the watch collecting hobby. And I think that that's one of the most rewarding parts of what we do every day. Now, I'm curious what you think. Have your priorities changed since you first got into watches? Or do you still find yourself chasing the same kinds of things that you always have? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. So as always, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. And I appreciate you watching. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.